Hello and welcome now to this video. Why is the camera shaking so much? Anyway, so y'all haven't seen me in a little bit because truth be told, I haven't really been able to think of anything to really talk about. And I don't like just forcing a video just for the sake of having a video. I prefer to make videos about things that I want to talk about, right? So I was waiting until I had something that I wanted to talk about in mind before I created a video. And lo and behold, tonight I was thinking about my experience with being trans and stuff. And I thought, you know what? That would be a really great video to make, so that not only can it give other trans people a relatable thing, so they can be like, you know what, I've had similar experiences, or whatever, but hopefully it can also be an educational video for people who may not be trans but who want to kind of gain a little bit of insight into what trans people kind of experience. And I know that the more videos of this kind of nature are posted on the internet, the more visibility there is and the better it is overall. Especially given the times that we are living in right now and the enormous target that trans people have on our heads for no reason whatsoever outside of propaganda. That's really the reason why we have a target on our heads. Divide and conquer, that whole thing that I talked about in another video that I made. Anyway, so I wanted to talk about my experience with being trans. I literally already said that. So I guess I'll start from the beginning. So my mom and my dad loved each other very much. I'm just being stupid. No, I'll start from the beginning. So it wasn't until I was like maybe four is the number I remember, but I honestly, it could have been 5 or 6 potentially, but for some reason age 4 is what feels right to me. So that's usually what I go with. But around the age of 4 is when I started noticing something different about myself. I didn't understand it. I didn't understand what it was that felt different, but I knew there was something different. I felt it in me bones, and I didn't really think too much of it. I just kind of I felt it. I felt this very strange feeling of something is off. I don't quite feel like me. I feel like a different person, somebody who's not me. And when I say this, by the way, I want to preface it by saying this was when I saw my reflection. It's like when I saw pictures of myself, when I saw my reflection, when people would address me, that's when that disconnect happened. Outside of that, when I was just living my life on my own, in my mind, I had an idea of who I was. And this is going to be something that exists my entire life, right? But at that time, at that age, I didn't understand why I felt that way and what it meant. And, I had no understanding of it all. And then it wasn't until I was maybe 8, 9, 10 years old is when I started understanding a little bit better what that weird, off feeling was. And I recognized it as, oh, I like girl things. That's how I identify with that, right? I want long hair. I want to be feminine. I want to play with, Barbie dolls or whatever. Not to say that toys are, an indicator of gender identity. They're really not. But that was one of the things that I remember happening is I wanted to play with Barbie dolls, number 1, because I liked Barbie dolls growing up. But number 2, not specifically Barbie dolls, by the way, just dolls in general. That was number one. Number two, uh, it was me understanding that it's because I identified as a girl. So it wasn't like I said, toys don't mean gender identity, but in my case, it was aligned, right? The wanting to play with dolls and identifying as a little girl were aligned. Anyway, whatever. I feel like I convoluted that one way more than it needed to be, but here we are. I keep hitting this and it keeps making the camera shake. I'm so sorry about that. Anyway, so it wasn't until like around 8 years old when I started realizing those things. And then I never really, I couldn't really do anything about it. So it was always just something that would just be in the back of my mind, and I would try to like push it down. Like, no, that can't be. Like, I'm just gonna continue living my life as a boy because that's what everybody keeps telling me I am, so I have to be, right? And then fast forward to roughly 15, 16, 17 years old. I'm in high school at this point. And I start having an even better idea of what's going on with me and how I feel. Like specifically, it started when I was like 14, like the better understanding. But it wasn't until I was like 16 when I even learned what the word transgender was, right? Prior to that age, I didn't even know that was a thing. And let me tell you, when I learned what transgender was and what it means and all of that, it was a game changer for me. Absolute game changer, because I finally had answers to how I was feeling, right? So I understood how I was feeling prior to understanding the word trans and transgender and all of that. But that learning what that was really brought it home for me, like, oh shit, that's what it is. And so my experiences throughout all of this, being 4 years old and a little kid and stuff like that, I felt the off feeling, but I didn't think too much of it. Like it wasn't really something that like resonated within me or anything like that. I just kind of understood like, okay, there's something off. Something doesn't feel quite right. Like I remember very vividly a memory I have. That's what anyway, I was redundant there. That's what I was trying to get at. I have a very vivid memory of one time my mom taking my brother and I to get haircuts. And I remember she used to like cutting our hair very short. And for me specifically, she liked styling. I don't know what it's called, but it's like when it's really, really short, but then there's like a little length on top, and then like it comes forward and then like a little flip at the front. That's the style my mom really liked for me for some reason. And that's the style she always went with for me. I hated it. But I also hated having boy haircuts. I wanted long hair when I was a kid. But anyway, so I remember getting the haircut, and I remember like feeling like doing this with the short hair and like feeling it. Number one, because I liked the texture, I liked the feeling of that. But number two, it would also make me feel a little weird and uneasy, like feeling that. So it was like a two-parter thing of why I would do that. And I have that very vivid memory of that time of feeling my hair like that, and then feeling like sensory pleasure, but at the same time feeling very uneasy and feeling like this doesn't feel right. So that was like when I was a kid. Those were kind of the experiences that I would have. It was with haircuts. There was also like, I remember wearing, like I was a little bit older at this point, like maybe this is kind of transitioning more into like 8 years old. So when I was like 8, 9, 10 years old, around there, the whole hair thing was still happening. So keep that in mind. But then also, this was around the time when I was required to wear, like if I was going to go to a church or something, I was required to wear like a little boy like suit kind of thing. And I remember wearing the suit and really hating it because it was a sensory nightmare for me around the neck area, because those Suits, they go right up to the neck when you button them all the way. And it was a huge sensory issue for me. I hated it. But on top of that, in the same capacity that I really enjoyed the hair feeling and also didn't like it and felt uneasy about it, it was the same thing with shoes, the dress shoes, men's or boys' dress shoes. I liked the tippy tappiness of them, but I hated the shoes because they were very like hard. I don't know how to describe it other than that. They were very hard and they were like weird to wear for me. They were very weird. And I didn't enjoy that. And then as I got older and went into my teen years, all of the feelings I started recognizing, like I recognize them now as dysphoria is what I was feeling. But all of the feelings became more intense. So it's like I couldn't find the joy that I once was able to because I was so tapped out of my senses. Because when I was a kid, I was a little bit more tapped into the senses. But around my teenage years, I started tapping more into my intuition. And because I was tapped out of my senses almost entirely as a teenager, I couldn't find that joy in those things anymore. And so it was just a lot of dysphoria. And I remember at the start of 9th grade, I started growing my hair out because finally I was at an age where even though my mom really wanted to, my mom was a helicopter parent. I gotta preface here. My mom was a huge helicopter parent. I don't need to get into the specifics, but when I entered high school, it was around the age where I could finally like decide for myself what kind of hair I wanted. And even though my mom wanted me to cut my hair, she couldn't force me to cut my hair. So I never did. So I began growing my hair out. Speaking of hair, I had hair in my mouth. So I started growing my hair out around that age. And I remember as it was growing out, the sheer euphoria I had of having longer hair and just feeling like more at peace with that, with the hair aspect of things. I loved like, you know, being able to play with my hair. I loved being able to like twirl it on my finger and all sorts of things. And yeah, so that was one of the experiences I had as a teenager. But even though I had that part, I was still very dysphoric, right? I'm Italian. I'm just primarily Italian. So there's a lot of body hair, and especially pre-hormones, that was a huge issue for me. You know, that's when I started growing facial hair, and it was thick and everywhere on my face. I have since lasered all that shit off my face. It was very painful, very expensive, and it was like 2 years or so of lasering it all off my face, but I'm so happy that I did. Anyway, so that was around the time when facial hair started coming in. It wasn't super prominent in high school. It was really after high school is when it really started like kicking in, but it started in high school. It was very like a little bit, not a whole lot. That was one thing, that was one aspect in high school. Other aspects were definitely the social aspects of things, you know, being treated as a man or boy or whatever. I don't know what a teenage boy, I guess you could say. Being treated as a boy during that age. I closed myself off entirely to dating, even though, you know, I'm attracted to men. I'm not attracted to women at all. And even in high school, there were a few instances of dudes that would try to talk to me and try to like get to know me and like whatever. But they were looking for gay relationships, and I was not looking for a gay relationship. I was looking for a heterosexual relationship. And so on top of that, I also just didn't feel comfortable dating as I was back then. And this is something that rang true for a very long time for me. It wasn't until I started transition, basically. I did not feel comfortable dating until I transitioned. And even now, even still, even now that I have, I've transitioned. I started my transition in 2021, so it's been 4 years now. And even still to this day, there are aspects of me that I feel a little bit uncomfortable in a dating situation with. Mainly, the sexual aspect of dating, sex, right? I'm so very dysphoric with my genitalia. That's just how it is. It is an area of dysphoria for me. The thing is that the interesting thing about this, I will say, prior to hormones, my genitalia was not the thing I was most dysphoric about. It wasn't even like on the list of the most dysphoric things. I was very indifferent about it. For me, the most dysphoric thing was the beard. That was why it was priority number one. That was the first thing I did after I started hormones, was lasering off the facial hair. And I've also lasered my arms. I wish I could have lasered my legs, but unfortunately that still remains unlasered. But with hormones, the hair doesn't grow that quickly at all. If I shave today, I can go like 2 weeks without having to shave again. So that's pretty good. Anyway, but the genitalia was not an area of dysphoria for me prior to hormones. But post hormones and after I lasered all the facial hair off my face, my genitalia has slowly but surely become like the number one thing of dysphoria for me, which is something that I was not expecting, because I always thought, well, I'm indifferent about it now, so I don't think that would change with hormones. Lo and behold, it has changed for me. And I'm at a point where I'm like highly considering bottom surgery now. Anyway, so growing up, I was not dysphoric with the genitalia. And so that wasn't a thing for me. The dysphoria for me growing up was really the social aspect, the body hair, and the facial hair. And also my face. And also, I used to be very dysphoric with my hands. I know a lot of trans people can relate to that, specifically trans women, but I'm sure there are trans men who can also relate to hand dysphoria. It's a very weird thing, but it's a very real thing for trans people, right? I have since, my hand dysphoria is really not that bad anymore since I've started hormones. I have finger dysphoria. These are things that I never really thought I would be talking about, but here we are, or here I am talking about it. But yes, finger dysphoria is a thing for me. My feet, I'm also very slightly dysphoric about my feet. My knees, I'm dysphoric about my knees as well. And my legs in general, there's a little bit of dysphoria there. It's very crazy how dysphoria works. You get dysphoric over the weirdest things. I used to feel very dysphoric about my brow ridge right here, because I have, in my opinion, a semi-prominent brow ridge. But over time, that dysphoria of the brow ridge has kind of calmed down, because there are plenty of women who have slightly prominent brow ridges. Cis women, I mean. There are plenty of cis women that have semi-prominent brow ridges, and a lot of the things that used to make me super dysphoric before have eased. Like my forehead used to cause me a lot of dysphoria, my wrinkles, forehead wrinkles. But a lot of that has kind of calmed down over the years, since I've started my transition. But outside of all of this, my experience with just being a trans person, it's a very interesting experience, because I feel like most people, everyone, can relate to having an identity crisis of sorts. But I think when it comes to trans people, we kind of take the cake on that end, because for us, it's not an identity crisis of oh my God, who am I? Am I a nerd? Am I a jock? Am I a whatever? It is who the fuck am I? Just as a person. Who am I as a person? Right? It's more like I feel like the identity crisis for trans people, if you are discovering your identity, it's more intense. But for for people like me, who I wasn't discovering my identity, I knew my identity, I just had a lot of conflicting feelings about it. That's where the identity crisis came from for me. So it was like I didn't feel connected to my body. I felt very disconnected from my body. And if you saw one of my previous videos where I talked about like dissociation and INFJ identity and INFJs, then you'll understand that this, when I say I felt disconnected from my body, it was like tenfold disconnection, to the point where I would see my reflection in the mirror and it just wouldn't feel like who I was. And even outside of that, when I wasn't looking at the mirror, like just going about my day, I didn't feel real. And this is something that is known in the psychology world as like depersonalization or dissociation, or whatever the actual term is. But for me, it was because of being trans, not because of any trauma or anything like that. And speaking of trauma, I had a lot of trauma growing up with regard to my identity, in the sense that there were times where I would get so caught up in thinking about like, woe is me, my life is unfair, so on and so forth, that I would just, there were a number of times throughout my life, especially in my teen years, where I would just get out of the house and start walking, and just walk with no destination at all. And I would just go for like an hour just walking, and I would be so blacked out of that reality, and I had no idea that I was even walking, to the point where there was one time where I walked like 2 miles away from my home, and I found myself in a very dangerous neighborhood, and there were almost no street lights, and it was very dark because it was nighttime. And I remember I had my phone with me because I had a cell phone at that time. I know, like, I'm aging myself here. I'm 32. And when I was a teenager, cell phones were not like what they are today. It was like the little brick phones. But I had one of those brick phones at that time, and I had it with me because I had just come home from going out, like spending the night with friends and stuff like that. And I just got in my own head about things, and I got home and I just decided I'm just gonna go walking. And it wasn't even walking to clear my head. It was walking because I was so done with life and existence that I blacked out and just walked. But fortunately, I had my phone with me. And I remember when my parents didn't see that I went inside and that I wasn't inside the house, they freaked out and they called me. And that's what kind of snapped me out of that blacking out, right? And I remember that I got scolded, and because they were freaking out. And this happened a few times in my teen years, but it happened once when I was a kid. And speaking of all that negative feeling, I was also very suicidal. I guess I gotta put, trigger warning, talk about suicide here. But I was very suicidal at that time. And this is something that unfortunately far too many trans people can relate to. It's very, very sad. And it breaks my heart whenever I hear stories of trans people, and I see their stories online and they talk about their experiences with this. But, my experience with it was, I would get to a point where I just didn't see the point in living anymore. And there were a number of times where I would attempt it. I even had, a few times I had a knife up to my throat ready to just end it. And the only thing that kept me from doing that was the thought of my family. It was the thought of my parents and my brother, because he was living with us at that time. It was the thought of all of them finding my bloody, lifeless corpse just laying on the kitchen floor with no explanation as to why I did that. Because they didn't know I was trans at that time. So they wouldn't have had anything. They wouldn't have had anything to know why I did it. And they would have lived with that forever. And knowing my parents, they would have blamed themselves for it. And that would have destroyed them. And knowing all of that is really what kept me from actually going through with it. But it was a very difficult existence until I transitioned. It got easier in my 20s because it was a lot easier for me to cope with things, even though it was still very difficult to live, right? There was still an air of not really caring if I died. And so this kind of resulted in, and also a disconnect from my body, right? That was still a very prominent thing. But all of that kind of created this air of like, I'm not taking care of myself. I was not taking care of myself at all. You know, I have cholesterol issues because of underlying medical issues that I've had, you know, that are just genetic issues, unfortunately for me. So one of the things that happened was when I was 23 or so, I was diagnosed with hyperlipidemia. And if you don't know what that is, the medical term, it basically means high cholesterol, high triglycerides, so on and so forth. And that is due because of, I have fatty liver disease, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. I've had that since I was a kid. And that is caused because of a genetic disorder called alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency. So we're just having a fun time over here with all the medical issues that I have. But anyway, that's beside the point. But when I was 23, I was diagnosed with that. And my diet of like, because I didn't care what I put in my body, it didn't matter to me. And so at that time, that scare really like, I was able to find a part of me that wanted to change it, and I was able to improve my situation, and I even lost a bunch of weight. But then it got hard to maintain that long term because I just didn't even want to be around, really. I wasn't suicidal anymore, thankfully, but I didn't have a will to live. I didn't have any will to even create a future for myself or anything. And so from 23 to 28, those 5 years, I was just kind of existing. I wasn't even living. I was just existing in those 5 years. And really what kept me going was my best friend. You know, she's really what kept me going all those years. And I will always be grateful for that. And I know she's watching, so don't get all sentimental on me. But it is, you know, it's true. You were really the thing that kept me going. And then at 28, unfortunately, my mom dies. And that just, it plummeted my mental health because of the whole grieving process. But shortly after she died, I began my transition. And the reason why that aligned that way is because in my mind, I thought that my mom was holding me back from being able to transition. And I've come to realize that I was holding myself back. You know, she wasn't holding me at gunpoint or anything to not transition. I just wasn't doing it because, you know, I had a very contentious, is that the word? Is that even a word? I had a rough relationship with my mom. I'll put it that way. I had a very rough relationship with her because she wanted me, she was very uncomfortable with me being trans, right? And her reasoning was always, I care about you, I want the best for you. But she would be pretty, there's no other way to put it, she was pretty fucking mean at times when it came to my identity. I'm not gonna go into like specifics, but she was pretty mean. And that kind of created in me this like, I don't want to transition because I feel like if I transition, I'm gonna like have issues with her, and it's gonna create issues between us. My chair keeps leaning back. It's gonna create issues between us, and I don't really feel comfortable with that. So I just didn't transition. But in hindsight, I wish I did. I wish I could have transitioned sooner. Because I would have loved for my mom to have met the real me, not the person I was pretending to be. And something that, kind of bogs me down every now and then, but I've come to terms with it. But I would have really loved to be able to experience life as I do now with my mom around. And that is something that I have to live with, where I can't really have that anymore. There's no possibility for that. And so I've come to terms with that. It still hurts, but I have definitely come to terms with that. In terms of the rest of my family, there's a lot of nuance that goes into that because, of events that have taken place. Again, not going to go into specifics here because I don't want to be putting my whole business out there. Not yet, at least. But basically, to put it in ways where, like, I guess my audience can understand, like where you guys can understand why it was like kind of rocky. There's a lot of religion that comes with my extended family. They are religious people, but they're not like the typical type of religious person you think of who's like, oh, anti-trans entirely and whatever. Like, no, they're open people. They truly are. But I wasn't feeling respected because there was a lot of misgendering going on. And I have since, understood that I was just overreacting because I was too caught up in my own feelings about things. But unfortunately, in getting caught up in my own feelings about things, I sent a letter to them via text message that kind of said, I'm out. I don't want to be a part of this family anymore. Do I regret sending the letter? I do. I do regret sending that letter. I wish I hadn't. But I also don't regret separating myself. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but one of the main ones is separating myself. I was able to truly find myself again and truly, come into my own. I don't think I would have been able to if I had continued being around them, because in a way they were unintentionally so, but they were holding me back. Not in the way that you might think. Not in the like, we don't want you to transition. Like, not that kind of thing. In just the way they are. And I know that sounds a little mean, but stay with me for a second here. What I mean to say is that they kind of exist in this realm where a lot of the time they're not really thinking of life in the capacity that I'm thinking of life and existing, right? They are still very much trapped in the very I'm trying to find my words here because this is a very difficult thing to explain here, but they're still very stuck in like the surface level of humanity, and they exist on that plane, And what I mean is like, oh, we don't mention things that are going on because it's going to create conflict. And oh, we have issues with these people, or this thing happened with these people. And it's very like that kind of level where it's all about just the personal day-to-day stuff. And I don't exist in that plane. And I never really wanted to exist in that plane to begin with. I'm a very a deeper person. I exist in the depths of humanity. And so being around that kind of energy really brings me down. Anyway, this is probably a very weird way to explain all of that, but that's the best way that I can explain it, at least right now. But anyway, back to the main point. There was a lot of contention with my extended family. And unfortunately, me transitioning kind of exacerbated, I won't say exacerbated, but it kind of like brought out certain aspects of certain people in my family that I didn't like. And so I felt the need to separate myself from that. But I've come to realize I don't want to leave things like that with them. And I want to be able to make amends. Well, I won't say make amends, but I want to at least be on talking terms with them. But my experience with them was very, it's like they knew, because I didn't do exactly the greatest job hiding the fact that I didn't identify as a man growing up. But I don't think they knew I was necessarily trans, at least not all of them. Some of them probably, but not all of them. They all assumed I was gay, most likely. And then I came out as trans, and, some members of the family were very, they kept a level of respect for my identity. But the issue that I had was that they wouldn't enforce things when other people of the family wouldn't respect or wouldn't use my correct name and pronouns. And so it created this situation where I felt seen and unseen at the same time. And I felt like the seen part was weighted. I don't know if that makes any sense. Where it's like, you're seeing me, you're respecting my name and pronouns, but then when other members of the family aren't using my name and pronouns, you're not calling that out. That happened quite a bit in that family. Anyway, whatever. I don't know how I got on that whole tangent of all of that, but basically my experiences with being trans were very tumultuous, to say the least. There was a lot of heartache and a lot of emotion and a lot of heavy emotions. And I want to conclude this very long video. I'm so sorry it's so long. But I want to conclude it by saying, I used to think that, or I used to have the belief that I wish I didn't have this experience in life and that I wasn't trans. I used to have that belief. But I've kind of come to learn that I'm almost happy. I'm almost kind of happy that I've had this experience. And I think that I was meant to have this experience. I think this was my soul energy, whatever you want to call it, deciding to have this existence so that I can learn from it. Because being trans has really, really offered me an opportunity and a perspective in life that I don't think I would have had otherwise. And you can say, like, that's something that you can say about about anybody and any existence. But I think specifically the trans existence is a very unique and very important existence, because it reminds people that humanity is a lot more diverse than we tend to think it is. And people have a tendency to forget that men and women are not so different. Not like, truly, they're not so different. There's a lot of similarities between the two. The only difference between men and women really comes down to hormones. And trans people kind of prove this. because, you know, I remember how I felt prior to hormones, and I know how I feel now post hormones. And prior to hormones, there were a lot of things I could relate to with men. And now post hormones, there's a lot of things I can relate to with women. And so I think this experience really, like being trans, really gives you that perspective of understanding both men and women on a very deep and profound level that if you aren't trans, you're just not going to understand it. Like, you can be told certain things and you can like have a grasp of them, but you won't really truly understand it unless you're a trans person and you exist in between the sexes, essentially, or in between the genders, whatever. You got what I'm saying? And for that reason, you know, I'm kind of happy that I'm trans and I've been allotted this experience in life. And yeah, I've been able to learn a lot about it, and I can share that knowledge in another video, the things that I've learned about being trans. This was like my experience. I guess the next video can be what I've learned. I promise not to make that one, 41 minutes long. Jesus Christ. I'm so sorry about that. I ramble a lot, and I had a lot to talk about this video. Anyway, so that was this video, and I know it was not the type of video where like you can really like learn something. I guess you can learn a little bit, I guess. But this was more so a video just to kind of put it out there what my perspectives on things are and my experiences with being trans and stuff like that is. Just for whoever, wants to watch it. And I apologize again for being very rambly, but as is my nature, right? I'm a rambler. Anyway, so that's the end of this video. I hope you gleaned something from it, whatever that might be. And as always, do not forget, up, down, left and right, Dance Dance Revolution, that subscribe button, wherever it may be for you. Toodaloo. I don't know. I'm signing off. Have a good day.